Have you ever been on a long commute and you see a billboard and it's outside this nice subdivision on the way home and it says something like, if you lived here, you'd be home already. But instead, you've got another 30 minutes of podcast before you actually get home. Well, I want to say that, at one point I pulled over and I'm glad I did because I made Elixir my home. For me, Elixir's clear contracts, the convenience of publishing with Hex, and this community has really helped me find a home as an open source developer. And today, I want to show you just how easy Elixir makes it to publish your own open source package. To do that, however, I have to start at the very beginning. So over the years, I've had a lot of careers. When I was in high school, I thought I was going to be a mechanic. Turns out that I became a fireman instead, and then a bartender, and finally I decided what I really wanted to do was to be a software developer. And my first taste of that life was installing and maintaining Oracle software. So now I have a question for you as my audience. One of these things is not like the other. So which job isn't like the other? And if you said bartender, well, then you'd be right. As a bartender, I was able to be creative. I made up new drinks, I would improvise on the spot, and in all the other jobs, I was kind of following a script, protocols, working within the confines of the tools and the systems that somebody else had built. Now, my job working with Oracle software mirrored my experiences that I'd had, wrenching on cars and firefighting. I was maintaining software someone else had written, and frequently my day really consisted of configuring settings. So I'd turn a setting from off to on, and then sometimes back to off, but the majority of that day was spent in GUIs. I didn't have the ability to alter or really even observe the software that I was configuring, and nothing that wasn't consumer facing. So what started as kind of this internship, became a career. I was climbing the ladder. I was good at my job. Deep inside though, I was kind of holding a secret, and it was a secret that I was ashamed to share with my friends. And I never really built anything, at least nothing that I could call my own or that people were using. I liked the people I worked with and I enjoyed my time there, but deep down I knew I wasn't where I wanted to be. And at this point, I should probably introduce myself. Hi, my name is Jeremy, Jeremy Searls. My friends call me Jerry. We're friends now, so you can call me Jerry. And I want to talk to you today about my journey of building, my first open source package in Elixir with Hex. And so earlier when I said I hadn't built anything, it wasn't for lack of effort. I was constantly trying to build things in my free time, and I explored a lot of different languages and technologies. I would dive into each language with blog posts and docs, and quickly, I'd become proficient. Let me just show you. So I'll share some code snippets that I wrote during this time. So we'll start with Python, Ruby. I was getting into JavaScript, Go, C++, basically a polyglot at this point. But maybe not. In all seriousness, I felt like a tourist in each language. It's like you're visiting Paris, right? And you're on the plane, you're learning a few phrases, bonjour, how are you? But what I really wanted to do was walk into a farmer's market and ask, how's the rhubarb taste this year? I wanted to be part of a community. And in 2019, I had the chance. I was hired at cars.com as a junior Elixir developer, and maybe some of you even saw the talk here last year about cars.com's experience with Elixir. And I felt super lucky. I could make Elixir my full-time job. And I showed up. I had my first day. I was excited. And then as I met more of my colleagues, kind of the less confident I felt about myself. And pretty soon I was experiencing intense imposter syndrome. I was just terrified that someone would find out that I wasn't good enough or I wasn't keeping up and I'd be gone. Thankfully, I'm here to tell you that what I experienced was the exact opposite. My colleagues at Cars worked right alongside me. They made me feel at home. I also had a chance to work with developers from Dockyard and Test Double, and that was an awesome experience. And then last, I had all of you. So I had access to tons of Elixir community resources, the Elixir Slack, forums, docs, books, blogs, you name it. And I was rolling. I was writing my own PRs. I started taking ownership of areas of the code base. I formed my own opinions. I fixed some bugs that were and were not caused by me. I even led some small teams and started to mentor some of our junior developers. Over time, that imposter syndrome faded away, and I have this community to thank for that. So even with all my technical experience prior to working in Elixir, I never really felt like a real programmer. So becoming an Elixir dev at Cars really changed that. And it was kind of like the frog in the pot, right? The water was getting warmer and I barely noticed. And then suddenly, one day I was there. I was doing the work. I was in the code every day. And one of those days I noticed something, and it's actually the reason why I'm here talking to you. It was in an EEX template, just like any other day, and I was curious about a class that I saw in a div. The class was called cache value, and I didn't see it in our CSS file for the template, and I was kind of wondering, why is it there? So I searched through the CSS, couldn't find it, and I went through our JavaScript, and no dice. So I figured, well, if it's not for styling or for functionality, it's dead code, I'll delete it. And that was a mistake. So it turns out we were using the class, just not for what I thought. We were using it for testing and using a package called Floki to parse the HTML and using that class to find the field in the markup. And if you haven't used Floki, it's an awesome package. I would highly recommend it. But I hadn't seen this before. So in my career, I consider myself a middle-end engineer, so I don't feel as comfortable in the front end, and sometimes you gotta ask an expert, and I felt a little outside my wheelhouse. So I asked Richardson at cars.com about what I was seeing, and you said, why do we use these classes just for tests? And of course, like a pro, Rich threw it back, it's a good question. Is there a better way? And I had to do some research, and I found out that I wasn't alone. Multiple people pointed to using classes for testing can introduce a brittle testing pattern like I was experiencing. I started looking at other tags like rel and id, but they had specific uses and it didn't really fit my criteria. What I wanted was something versatile that we could use just for testing, just for QA, and when you saw that tag, you would immediately know why it was there. And thankfully, I wasn't alone either. I learned about the data attribute that was introduced in HTML5 and designed really to serve this very purpose. Good to go. So I went back to Rich and said, what about this data attribute? And he came right back at me. It's a great point. That's extra markup in our production code, right? Because whatever we add to our dev test code, is going to leak out into prod. But what if it didn't? What if we removed that attribute from prod? So Rich, we could remove it. And that is when he said it. And that statement was the catalyst for something big that, again, is why I'm here today. He said, it sounds great. Sounds like it'd be a good hex package. And I want to tell you that this is where I dove in head first in the project and I built this amazing app and entirely on my own. And I want to tell you that, but that is not the truth. The truth is that I once again felt way out of my league. It was one thing for me to write the code internally, but it's a whole nother story to build something that the world can see. And so if we go back to that first graph where I was feeling pretty good, after Rich's suggestion, the scale got a lot bigger and I felt a lot smaller because if, being a real programmer is right here, in my mind, being an open source developer is way up here. And I was right about here. So now what? I'm feeling in way over my head. And of course, I immediately came up with a bunch of excuses of why I should not build this package. Thankfully, though, this talk is about more than just building hex packages. It's a time for me to highlight the amazing people that encompass this community. And one of the first people that I talked to about this package was Sam Jones, a developer at TestDouble, and said, hey, it's only just a few lines of code. It's very small. Is it even worth its own package? And Sam said, yeah, simple's good. Do one thing well. And I talked to Michael Crum, a developer at Dockyard, and said, hey, if this is such a great idea, why hasn't someone else done it? It feels like there's a package for absolutely everything. And Crum had a good point too. Elixir's young. You, audience, can be the first to make a package. And finally I went back to Rich, who had suggested all along that I do this to begin with. And was I wasting my time? Would anyone use it? And he told me, you'll use it. And I would too. And it's kind of him to say, and it was a good point. Whether other people use it or not was a bonus. Really, it's something that I wanted to build. And so this was happening, whether I felt ready or not. And looking back, I never really felt ready for any of this, right? I just started doing things, and I had awesome people giving me feedback and advice along the way. So this would be no different. And with that, let's build a package. So I assume that's what you are here for, audience. And this project starts like most other Elixir applications. It's our good friend Mix. What's the hardest part of coding though? What do you name it? What do you name the package? I was trying to remove attributes from prod. So something with adder, removing adders, de-attribute. No, I didn't like that. Removing an adder's attrition. It's punchy, it's fun, check the box. So let's build attrition. And our new app will generate all we need to get started, which is great. We can hop right into the main application file, attrition.ex, and get to work. And I like to start small, like really small. Just a simple function that takes a string and returns an interpolated string with escaped quotes. And before going any further, with just our simple function, let's do something a bit brash and release it. Trust me on this. So after creating a public Git repo for the package, you can create a release in GitHub, or in this case, a pre-release with a tag. And the version tag is going to be your ticket to sharing the package. So we have an app, it's in pre-release. I mean, you're basically done. Maybe not. There's a lot of work to do, but what's the best way to go about it? And I was trying to think, what would it be like to experience attrition, my package, as a user? How could I develop with the user experience at the forefront of the process? And I imagine many of you are familiar with TDD, test-driven development, where you write a failing test, and then you make it pass, and then you refactor, and you repeat that. And how about README-driven development? Maybe you've heard of that, where you write a README describing the code that you wish you had. You write the actual code, and then profit? I don't know. There's a third step, I think, maybe, I don't know, but we'll just go with it. So let's spice things up. Let's try a new way of coding, and you may have heard of Swift playgrounds, so let's get that Swift out of there, and you got yourself Elixir playgrounds. So the first step is we're going to use the package. We're going to use it in a real app, and then make the package work, and that's it. We'll just build a package that you'd want to use. So to build attrition, then I need two apps. I need the package itself, and then some kind of a playground. So since I'd be designing attrition to be used with Phoenix, I could just have a Phoenix app as my playground.
So let's build a Phoenix app, and we do that by running mix Phoenix new and then the name of our application, which is attrition playland. Now running this command is going to generate a lot more output than just mix new, but it's everything that we need to get started. Here's what we generated. Let's hop into mix project, which is in mix.ex. This is the attrition playland app, the mix project, and we can add attrition as a dependency so that we can experience it just as a user would. Notice that we're referencing Git right now because our package is currently in pre-release, and also that the tag matches the tag that we created on GitHub. Running mix deps will fetch attrition from GitHub.
And now let's try to use attrition in the generated template just like a user would. So we create a div and we call that function. So attrition.datatest, and we pass it a string. We spin up a local host and look at the page source on the test app, and there it is. There's our data test attribute. And this works, but I didn't really like the API. It's a little messy, and it didn't solve the problem of removing the code from production. This would just show up in prod. So thanks to it being a public repo and having that Git release, I could share it. I could share the package as well as the playground of how to use it with anybody. And so I shared it with Rich and said, hey, check it out. And I'm getting started on this. And he said, nice. But what if you inject the code with a macro? And I'd never built a macro. So how do I do that? Well, thankfully, I work in Elixir, right? So I go to the docs. And the docs gave me exactly what I need to build my first macro. It's right there on the front page, our first macro. So let's build a macro. Where we do that? Well, we'll build the macro in our package in attrition. So back to attrition.ex, and we define a macro. So building a macro starts with def macro, right? Easy. What's a macro? Well, macros are special functions that are designed to return a quoted expression. So a quoted expression is a quote block. So whatever we write in the quote block will be inserted wherever the macro is called. And we are going to write code that writes code, which is super cool. So we add in the function from earlier, our code that writes code, and now this macro dynamically writes the function whenever and wherever it's used. So back to our Phoenix app, our playland, we can now use that macro just like a user would. So we go into the web.ex file, and let's see what this would look like for a user. We have our view definition, which also uses a quote block, which is cool because now I know what that means, and we can use attrition. So with one line, attrition is available to every template through the view by using use. I was getting close to my goal of just set it and forget it, and I wanted attrition to be something that had to be set once. It was super lightweight and had a very small footprint, and this really provided that. So staying in the Phoenix app, let's open up a template, the template we had before. So we have this attrition.datatest, that naive implementation. So we'll go from this to with the use macro to this. Data test is written in the view, so it's available to us right there. So my next step was to figure out how do I remove the attribute from prod, right? I still hadn't solved that. And through the power of open source, I dug into a few different packages and I wanted to see how they ticked. So this alongside blog posts gave me a good idea of where I wanted to go next. I needed a configuration. So I'd add a configuration line to the Phoenix app that would be using my package, specifically in the mixenv where I wanted the data attribute to appear. And then in attrition, I would check for that configuration and return either the data attribute or an empty string. Let's build it. Might be easier to just see it, right? So in the configuration for our Phoenix app, dev and test, it's going to look the same because those are the two environments we want the attribute to show up. So we'll add the module name as an atom, and at this point, instead of passing like an atom or a boolean to say like show or hide, I decided to pass the module instead. So I created a module that I would place the string function in, and for this, for the real version, it'd be reveal. So now the quote block will inject the code that is defined in the module we want, rather than just, you know, a single function. But we still have to build it, right? So the last step would be pulling that configuration into attrition and then writing the logic that would figure it out. So back in the main application file of attrition, I didn't want attrition to be constantly checking that configuration, right? I wanted it, read it once at compile time and basically forget it, you're done. So to do this, I would use a module attribute. I can use application.getEnv. I can grab the configuration that we set in the Phoenix app for each mixenv. And now the application using attrition will specify which module will be injected into the view definition with this data module key. And in the absence of a user configuring or wanting to see attributes, we'll hide them. So the third argument is the default, and in this case, it's a module I need to hide. So it's the opposite of a reveal. Now let's put it all together. It might be easier to see it. So here's the attrition module. So we have that module attribute that will return the module the user specifies or default. We can't reference the module attribute from within the macro, but we can create a public function that will return the value. So we create that public function, and using the same macro and quote block as before, we define a function that we want the macro to dynamically write. So just kind of a blanket data QA function. But then here's the twist. This function calls the configured module's version of the function. Stay with me. So we pass the value we get from the function defined in the quote block to the data module from the configuration. Simple, right? Well, it might be easier to see an artist's rendition of what this might look like at compile time. So at compile time, if the reveal module is past the configuration, it'll look like this. It would be calling attrition.reveal, and reveal would be a module that we build, we define. In the absence of a configuration, we use the hide module. So that's the default state. So just return me an empty string. I don't want to see anything. Well, let's build hide. So what do one of these modules even look like? And we can even test it. So we start with an even simpler function. It can take anything and return a string. And then we build on that. We add a spec. Why do we add a spec? Well, specs do two things. One is they provide documentation. So the spec that we write will show up in Xdocs. Also, tools like Dialyzer can read them and help find type inconsistencies and bugs. So quick example, let's say at some point we decide to return a number instead of a string. So we return the number 1 every time, not a string. Our spec says we return a string, but we're actually returning 1. Let's run Dialyzer. So Dialyzer performs the static code analysis and it failed. Why did it fail? Well, we broke the contract. We said we'd return a string, but we returned a number. So back to hide. On top of a spec, we'll want a doc. Docs add cherry on top, but unlike specs, if a doc's out of date, we don't have a feedback mechanism. So something to be aware of. And of course, we're good developers, so we're going to write tests. And XUnit comes out of the box. It provides everything we need. We added a describe block, a simple test. Given anything, returns an empty string and assert on it. And then run it. So wash, rinse, repeat. We'll write all of our tests and get that green light that we all so desperately search for. So with each iteration, I was growing stronger and I felt ready. I just had to configure it, right, to publish. And this can be done in the mix project of attrition. So attrition.mix project, we define the attributes that are going to show up in hex. The basic structure is provided for us from that original mix new command. It's all there. So we just have to customize it. So in the project definition, we have the app name, we have the version, and this is important because the version shown here is what's going to be shown on hex. So keep it consistent, keep it up to date, and when you want to publish the next version, update that GitHub version tag as well. The description is a private function with a here doc with fantastic description. I might be a little biased, but similar to description, there's a package function. So there's a private function called package, and we'll list the licenses if there are multiple. For me, it was just the MIT license that I committed through GitHub, as well as links. So a link to that GitHub. So the key is going to be the link text and the value will be the target. Finally, we add our dependencies. So this is a really simple package. There aren't many dependencies, and in all honesty, I wanted to design it that way. I wanted attrition to be as lightweight as possible, so I was cautious adding dependencies to the project. I can't tell you how many times Dialyzer saved me from myself, so that was something I wanted to add. And then Xdoc. So with Xdoc, you get automatic documentation builds when you publish your package. We'll see the output of Xdoc that Hex hosts in a minute, but a really good recommendation is running mixed docs locally before you publish. Make sure it looks nice. We also need to specify the Elixir version in our project, so do that. Start permanent. We'll terminate the node if the app terminates, and then build embedded will embed build artifacts instead of symlinks, two things that you want. Finally, as we used to say at the fire department, job's not done until the paperwork's done. So give Xdocs a little help. Here's some key value pairs, name, source, URL, docs that will assist Xdocs in generating our documentation. There's a lot more you can configure, but that should be enough to get started. So let's send it. I only have limited time. I'd encourage you to hit up Hex's publishing guide for more info, but this is enough to get going. So how do I do that? So step 1 of publishing, you got to register. You'll be asked a username, email, and password. Step 2, you build it. Step 3, you publish it. Yep. That's it. It is literally that easy. And the fun part is just like that, there it is. Within seconds, it is available on Hex, and you can see the links and the license that we specified in the project function. And the coolest part, in my opinion, and one of the hallmarks of Elixir, are the great looking docs that are generated and hosted for you as part of that publishing process. And there's a little more. For those that use Dash, like I do, as their documentation manager, your docs are available in Dash as well, which is awesome. So it's published, it's online. Now you just gotta wait for those downloads to roll in. Just keep waiting. Well, turns out that building the package is just one part of that process. The other part is marketing. You have to market your app, and trust me, I know that it is uncomfortable to be judged by people you don't know on the internet, and it is terrifying to be judged by your peers. But I think you might be surprised how supportive people can be, and especially people in the Elixir community. So part of that marketing is having a well-written README and something that provides clear instructions and information about your package. And I would encourage you to write the README that you yourself would want to use. I looked at my favorite packages and used the READMEs as kind of a template. So after making a little bit of a sales pitch internally at cars.com, we have some talks, we call it lightning talks. I opened a PR and delighted to see that people were engaging with attrition. I got some great implementation advice and a lot of encouragement. And my package is now part of our code. Is attrition perfect? No, not at all, far from it. But I'm proud of it. And if you're interested in working with it, or on it, or forking it, or rewriting it, go nuts. That's what open source is all about. I'm so glad that the people in our community encouraged me to write it. So now, let me be that person for you. Do you have an idea? Build it. Let this talk be the catalyst for that. And I'm serious when I say, if I can do it, so can you. One more thing before I go, I would like to extend an invitation to you to come write Elixir with me at cars.com. We are hiring Elixir developers. So tweet at me, check out our careers page on the site, drop me a line. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Have a great day.